I want to start with the people who matter most, the victims or survivors, as many prefer to be known. When you read the report, almost all of them are numbers, prefaced by a letter. And what we've all got to remember, though, is that every one of these is an individual with their own thoughts, their own traumas, and their own terrible story they've been dealing with for so very long. So to all the survivors of Savile and Hall, every one of you, on behalf of the BBC, I would like to say this. What happened was profoundly wrong. It should never have started. It should certainly have been stopped. Whatever the circumstance and background to it, and clearly these reports explain this in some considerable detail, sexual abuse is sexual abuse. It can never be excused. Whatever the issues are for the BBC, there is as nothing compared to your pain. A serial rapist and a predatory sexual abuser both hid in plain sight at the BBC for decades. It was a dark chapter in the history of the organisation, but a much darker one for all of you. The BBC failed you when it should have protected you. I am deeply sorry for the hurt caused to each and every one of you. I also know that it cannot have been easy for you to come forward and confront the past like this. Many of you have done so for the first time. I admire your courage. I'm grateful for your honesty. Your voice has finally been heard, but I also recognise it's been heard far, far too late. So today we say sorry, we let you down, and we know it. We also say thank you. Your courage in speaking out lights the way for us all. And now we must do everything possible to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. We will learn the lessons of this dark period for ourselves, and we will help share them with others. The two reports commissioned by my predecessor have many judgments for us to reflect on and much advice to offer. They draw conclusions and demand responses. But the most powerful of their contents, the parts that, once read, cannot be forgotten, are the stories of the survivors themselves. For everyone who truly wants to understand, this is the place to start, and I would urge every one of you to read those chapters. It's all there. The scale, the nature of what they did was truly terrible. The way that Savile used his celebrity to promise access to excitement and fun, and then grotesquely exploited it. The oppressive power of his fame and his physical presence. The sense that no one would believe a complaint. Even in their own families, survivors felt alone. The idea that he was known as King Jimmy. There was no escape from him. And I quote, "No one will believe you." The idea that it was all right because that's Stuart Hall for you. Another who said that when she heard the report of Savile's death, she blurted out that she was glad he was dead, and then told her husband for the first time that Savile had raped her. And there was, if I may, one account that particularly stuck in my mind, one that hit me personally. One of the survivors was told, "Keep your mouth shut, he's a VIP." This hit me because it made it so very clear that we, the BBC, did that. Jimmy Savile committed many crimes in many places, but uniquely, it was the BBC that made him famous. We made him a VIP. And what this terrible episode teaches us, among other things, is that fame is power, a very strong form of power, and like any form of power, it must be held to account. It must be limited. It must be scrutinised. And it wasn't. It's too easy to say that this took place a long time ago, in another time and another BBC. We're not going to say that. The report identifies many failings. Saying, of course, that all of it was in the past would be wrong. The BBC is its past as well as its future. And we've taken pride and drawn strength from all we have been and all we have done. What sort of organisation would we be if we celebrated our history but failed to take responsibility for it? Before I talk of the action we're going to take, let me add one more thing. I note that the reports did not conclude that, in a formal sense, the BBC knew about Savile. But I take no satisfaction from that. It seems to me that the BBC could have known. Just as powerful as the accusation "you knew" is the legitimate question, how could you not have known? And much of this was down to the culture of the BBC at the time, which we must reflect on and act on. It was an organisation that was too hierarchical, too self-interested, too siloed to hear or act properly on the disturbing stories and rumours individuals had heard. So, what happens now? This has been one of the most important inquiries in the history of this organisation. It's interviewed almost 500 people, taken nearly 3 years, and cost £6.5 million. It covers 1,000 pages and 3 volumes. And the nature of this inquiry has placed a very great responsibility on everyone to be open and frank, however painfully and however painful for them personally, to help us understand and learn from what happened in the past. I would very much like to thank Dame Janet Smith and Dame Linda Dobbs for their detailed and authoritative work. And the best way I can do that is by undertaking the period of careful reflection and self-examination that the review recommends. Let me be clear, I accept their conclusions and recommendations in full. And I believe it's equally important for me to say today that we have read, we have heard, we are listening, and we understand. We have read and heard how Hall and Savile abused and were able to continue their abuse because so much information was not acted upon. Dame Janet says she was struck by the amount of adverse material in the public domain. We understand how what happened had its roots in an organisation that was too hierarchical, too self-absorbed, too able to act properly on the disturbing stories individuals had heard. It would be a brave employee who would complain, even if they'd known how to. We realise there was a macho culture. There were very few women managers back then. And critically, we recognise we need to carry on the work we've been doing to get our child protection policies right. And we understand from these reports that our ways of communicating within the BBC were inadequate. One part of the organisation didn't talk to another. No sense then of us being one BBC. There was too much stress on protecting the reputation of the corporation as opposed to protecting staff and the people coming to enjoy our shows. And we should reflect with sorrow on the fact that, although the BBC was as prone as any to the willful blindness to sexism and sexual harassment that affected many organisations, it's even worse for us when our duty is to be better. Let me now turn to action, to what we have been doing and what we're going to do. Dame Janet makes one overarching recommendation: for the BBC to review and independently audit all the policies we have in place that help people raise complaints and concerns. We will do that. But let me also be clear, since I became Director General, we haven't been standing still. We have made this a priority, and there is much we have done already. We now have a new child protection policy shared across the industry and a detailed procedure for complaints. We have child protection advisors working together across the organisation. We've also put in place an improved whistleblowing policy supported by an independent investigations unit. And we've brought in a wide-ranging set of measures to encourage people to raise concerns about bullying and harassment, with a confidential hotline, independent experts assigned to cases, and a service to allow mediation to take place wherever possible. We've also wanted to make sure that these changes were achieving what we wanted them to do. So in March 2014, we asked some external and independent experts, the Good Corporation, to audit our policies, to make sure they were fit for purpose and to recommend improvements. They found that the BBC has strong child protection policies in place and that our whistleblowing policy ranks well compared to other organisations. But they also made 53 recommendations for improvement. Of these, 51 are now complete, 1 is underway, and in another case, we've agreed to take forward what needs to be done, but in a different way. So there are many things we've done, and there are many more things we will have to do, because we cannot be complacent. We will, as Dame Janet recommends, review all our policies and procedures in the light of her report and that of Dame Linda. I have asked Anne Bulford, the BBC's Managing Director of Operations and Finance, to lead this work, reporting to me. This work will identify any areas where we need to do more. I am committed, we are all committed, to creating an open BBC where everyone has the confidence to raise issues and believe that something will be done about them. I want the BBC to be a great place to work, a place where people come to do the best work of their lives. Anne's work will help us make sure that this is the case, and we'll publish our progress in full in July alongside our annual report. But there are some things we can commit to today. On whistleblowing, we will launch a campaign to do more to raise awareness of staff to what they can do and must do, and also where they can turn to for help. On child protection, we will work with the NSPCC to get their advice on how to help us build on what we're currently doing. And we will, as Dame Janet asks, commission another independent audit to assess our progress, to test our systems, to see how our policies are operating in practice. This work will report in the autumn, and whatever recommendations are made, we'll carry them out. But I also want to make a further commitment. I want the BBC to do more as a programme maker, following on the fine work in this area done in the past by Dame Esther Ranson with Childline. We will, for example, work with the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, NAPAC, to raise awareness of the issues surrounding abuse. On BBC One, we have already commissioned a documentary called The Abused. This gives the opportunity for many survivors who came forward as part of Operation U-Tree to share what happened to them. I want us to be a forum for a national debate about child abuse and how we can do more to support survivors. For me, reflecting on both these reports, the importance of getting the culture right in our organisation is key. When I came back to the BBC 3 years ago at a time of crisis, I could see that we needed to change. I visited teams from all over the UK who told me how proud they were to work for the BBC, how committed they were to the BBC, but they told me we needed to change. We have changed, we are changing, but we need to do more. Dame Janet says we should look carefully at 3 areas: a lack of cohesion in the BBC, the hierarchical nature of the management structure, and our attitudes towards the talent. These are all crucial issues, one we are thinking about already, and which we will push forward on in the coming months. We are, for a start, building a simpler BBC with fewer divisions, fewer boards, fewer layers between the top of the organisation and the front line, with senior leaders who are more visible, accountable and approachable, where we work together as one team for one BBC, with management that's enabling and supports creativity, management that demonstrates zero tolerance of bullying and harassment, where the values that all of us who work here believe in are the values we live day by day, and where everyone feels able to speak truth to power. These two reports tell me that the process we've begun of reforming this organisation must continue. And, as is well known, I'm already looking at the future shape of the BBC, and I'll have more to say next month. I want this to help managers to take more responsibility for their actions, and also to ensure the BBC is less hierarchical, less siloed, one BBC. We'll be helped by our independent director, our senior independent director, Dame Fiona Reynolds, who I've asked to advise us on this important work to ensure we live the values we believe in. Finally, I want to share with you Dame Janet's reflection when she handed me her final report. One of her aims has been to paint a vivid picture of Jimmy Saville so we can all understand his modus operandi, which will help us learn lessons for the future. Part of that goes to the persona that Saville created and that the BBC contributed to, that he was the nation's favourite uncle, making children's wishes come true and doing a great job for charity. But, just as chilling, is what we see about how people responded to this persona, how they accepted it, how they failed to take steps to question it. And we must take note of Dame Janet's final words. She says that no organisation can be completely confident that it does not harbour a child abuser. Child sex abusers can be highly intelligent, articulate and charismatic, but manipulative people. That's why the biggest lesson for me is that we all have to be eternally vigilant. In conclusion, I would like to say this to the survivors of Savile and Hall. You have shown extraordinary courage in coming forward and telling us all what you went through. We are determined to honour your courage. We will learn the lessons from these terrible times. We will confront the issues head-on. We will continue to address them in an open and honest way, and we will be there for you. So over time, the BBC can be a stronger and better organisation, and we can help bring some closure to this dark chapter. That is the very least we owe you. Thank you. And before I take questions, please let me introduce Rona Fairhead, Chairman of the BBC Trust.
Good morning. I am saddened and appalled by the events recounted here. And in a few moments, I want to address how we will aim to ensure that they are never allowed to happen again. But our primary thoughts must be with the victims, the survivors of the abuse perpetrated by Jimmy Saville and Stuart Hall. Today's reports lay bare the full horror of what happened to them. Those experiences can never be erased. No one reading the reports can be in any doubt that the BBC failed them. It failed not just them, but the public, its audiences, and its staff. It turned a blind eye where it should have shone a light, and it did not protect those who put their trust in it. On behalf of the BBC and its staff, past and present, I want to apologise to the survivors for all they have suffered. I also want to commit to them directly that we will ensure the BBC does everything it possibly can to prevent any such events in the future. And I also want to record my thanks. We owe the survivors an enormous debt of gratitude for the courage that they have shown in coming forward to share their experiences, their horrific experiences, with the review team. Their bravery has created a vastly deeper understanding of the issues, and I am confident that from here forward, nothing will be the same. We believe that these reports are clear, thorough, and authoritative, and I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dame Janet Smith, Dame Linda Dobbs, and the review team. We accept the conclusions and the recommendations of their reports in their entirety. We have published both reports in full and unredacted. It is transparently in the public interest to do so. The survivors and the public have a right to understand not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen. Who knew what and why processes failed? And to have the confidence that the BBC is taking all appropriate action. We need to ensure that the public's trust in the BBC is restored. We need to demonstrate through our actions that the BBC's values are for everyone and non-negotiable. For, as Dame Janet makes clear, these events happened in the past, but they raise serious issues that remain relevant and need to be addressed today. We fully support Dame Janet's recommendation that the BBC executive immediately reviews its policies and procedures on child protection, complaints, whistleblowing, and investigations, and that all of those should be independently audited and published. It is important that this work also takes account of the variety of working relationships the people have with the BBC, from freelancers and occasional contractors through to full-time members of staff. The plan that Tony has put forward today represents a thorough response to this recommendation, and the Trust will work alongside the Executive to ensure that the BBC takes all further steps that it needs to as quickly as it possibly can. Dame Janet also makes challenging observations about the BBC's culture. It is clear that the public expect the BBC to keep to the highest possible standards, but the BBC failed. And Dame Janet finds the status given to celebrities, the BBC's hierarchical structure, the lack of cohesion between its different departments present unique challenges which must be overcome if serious wrongdoing is to be exposed. The culture change that must take place has to be both substantial and permanent. The BBC must engage fully with its staff, listen to its critics, and submit policies and its culture to external scrutiny. I have discussed this with Tony Hall at great length and have no doubt that he is absolutely committed to achieving this. He also recognises that for change to be genuine and lasting, it requires the active involvement and support of those working within and around the organisation. The Trust will do whatever it can to help the management achieve this change, and if necessary, but we have had no need to date, to push them to do more or go further. These are long-term and deep-seated issues to tackle. But today's reports provide a clear impetus to do so urgently and openly. To that end, the Trust will continue to pursue these questions with the DG, taking stock of his and the organisation's progress at each of its monthly meetings for the remainder of the year. These events will forever be a source of deep regret and shame. Many people were failed by those who should have protected and supported them. Our commitment to the survivors and to the public is to ensure we do everything possible to prevent this happening again. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to questions. Beth?
Remember to say where you're from.
Yeah, thanks. Lord Hall, question about Tony Blackburn. Can you tell us why the BBC has sacked Tony Blackburn? He claims he's a scapegoat and a victim of the BBC's culture of whitewash and cover-up. What do you say to him?
Well, yes, let me say we've parted company. You've named him, he's named himself A7 as Tony Blackburn. Look, put this in context. This is one of the most important inquiries in the BBC's history. And that has put an even greater responsibility on everyone who took part in that inquiry to cooperate fully and to be open. So many survivors and witnesses have honestly and openly cooperated fully and at great personal cost to themselves. As Dame Janet has said, she's rejected his evidence, and she's explained very clearly why. I have to take that extremely seriously. My interpretation of that is that Tony Blackburn fell short of the standards of evidence that such an inquiry demanded. I am making no judgment or accusations about events or behaviours about what happened in the past, but simply about what he's done now and what he was doing in front of this really crucial inquiry.
Okay.
Jane Martinson from The Guardian. Can you say, following up from Beth's question about Tony Blackburn, are there more people who are going to lose their job, Tony, as a result of this report? And when it comes to talent, your speech at the beginning said that you would take it on board, but are you confident that the culture at the BBC and deference towards talent is any better now than it was then?
So let me say, first of all, I am making no judgments or any accusations about events in the past. I am making a judgment about the standards of behaviour I expect from everybody at the BBC now. And the only person who's still working at the BBC who is mentioned in this report is A7, or as we now know, Tony Blackburn. What I want out of the BBC, and by the way, this is something which I think the staff in the BBC and the people who pay for us also want, is an open culture where if things are wrong, you can address it. And if you're worried about addressing issues that are wrong directly with your management, there are other ways round to make sure that you can address those things. And I think I want a management where people are upfront about issues, deal with issues, and ensure that people are treated with respect, whether they're part of the organisation or not part of the organisation. And, you know, that's the challenge we've got. It's a bit like the Forth Bridge. We're going to have to keep working at it. I think we've made a lot of progress. I think we have a lot of progress to make as well. And to me, when you read chapter 5 of the Savile report, and you read what people have been through and continue to go through, and by the way, today I'm going to go through it all again because it's all out there, then I think it really behoves us to ensure that we have a culture inside the BBC that allows any future issues of sexual harassment, of bullying or whatever, to be openly and properly investigated, discussed. The staff want that, I'm sure, but boy, do we owe that to the survivors of Savile and of Hall.
Gentleman in the back there.
Lord Hall, Mark Williams-Thomas from ITV. On the eve of my programme, I sent you a right to reply. I appreciate it wasn't yourself, it was the BBC. And the response was, the BBC has conducted extensive searches of its files to establish whether there is any record of misconduct or allegations of misconduct by Sir Jimmy Savile during the time at the BBC. No evidence has been found. Whilst the BBC condemns any behaviour of this type alleged in the strongest terms, in the absence of any evidence or any kind found on the BBC that corroborates this, it is simply not possible for the corporation to take any further action 4 years, £6.5 million later. Do you regret those comments coming out from the BBC to simply dismiss the programme?
I was in a different place.
I accept that.
And so I'm not going to sort of comment on how things were held in the past. But let me pick you up on one point, and the £6.5 million. I think the £6.5 million, when you read what has been written today, we must think about the survivors of Savile and of Hall. And my job now is to build on this report and ensure that this can never happen again, despite the warning of Dame Janet quite correctly, that it behoves every organisation, including the BBC, to ensure that these people don't work for you. That's my main aim now, to ensure that we have an organisation that is responsive, that is open, that is the best place to work, that takes these issues seriously, where people can speak truth to power. That's what I'm keen to ensure. And I've started that process, but as Dame Janet reminds me, I've got a lot to do. I agree, we've all got a lot to do.
But the point that I'm making is that those allegations are very seriously being made. They were just dismissed by the BBC in a response to say, hopefully, it'll go away. Of course, it didn't go away. It led to the Director-General resigning. And obviously, we're now in a position where hundreds of people have come forward making allegations in relation to abuse that took place on the BBC. And the point being is that you did exactly the same as, or the BBC did, in 2012, exactly the same as it did many years previously, by dismissing such claims.
Let me answer it in a different way, which I hope you find answers the point. I sat and read every word of the 1,000 or more pages that the two dames have submitted to you all today. And as I was going through the reports, I was thinking each time, this is not in the past, this is now. What are the things we've got to learn about how a good organisation should operate that are lessons for the future? And one of them, I think, is the point you're making, which is not to dismiss people saying there's something wrong, you should investigate, not to come to conclusions, as I think you can read in this, you can see, you know, an investigation that seeks a conclusion that says there's not a problem. But actually, my task is to find and to discover and to ensure there are ways that we don't just push stuff under the carpet. We actually investigate. We ensure that we have a proper culture. And by the way, on the back of every BBC person's pass, there are things and values that we kind of believe in. And what I've got to do with the team, with the people in this organisation, is to ensure we have an open culture where people can say if things are going wrong, as well as celebrate those many things that go right.
Lucy Manning, BBC News. Do you accept Tony Blackburn's suggestion that he has been made a scapegoat by the BBC? And how much has the BBC paid out to the victims of Savile and Hall?
On Tony Blackburn or A7, I am quite clear that I'm making a judgment about how someone has engaged with this seriously important inquiry. I am sure all of you, including yourself, Lucy, have been through the 1,000 pages and are probably overwhelmed by the weight of evidence about both the nature of the survivors and what they've said, but also the cultural response of the BBC. And that's why I've decided what I've decided. I am making a judgment about the standards of behaviour I expect from everyone working at the BBC now.
Okay.
I think the survivors, all the cases of payments to survivors are concluded. I'm not sure quite what the amount is at the moment, but
we've published the totals on our website.
Yeah, but I can find out for you and I can let you have those. And if they're on the website, even better.
Okay. Chap on the far side just there.
Mark Watts from Exero. I want to turn to... could you both address this question, if possible, please? I want to turn to the whistleblowing policy. This was one of the elements that was taken away from the remit of Dame Janet Smith's report, I think by Lord Hall. You commissioned a separate report produced by a company by the name of Good Corporation, which gave you pretty much, gave the BBC pretty much a clean bill of health on its whistleblowing policy as it stands now, bar some criticism over lack of awareness amongst people working at the BBC. This is in sharp contrast to what we read at par 88 of Dame Janet Smith's report, where she says that she was particularly disturbed by the evidence about the extent to which staff were, and still are, afraid to raise complaints or concerns for fear of losing their jobs or the opportunity for promotion, or for freelancers, the fear of not being used again. Which of those two reports do you believe?
I don't answer the question, which do you believe? Let me just wind back. You asked, I think it was from you, asked Dame Janet about the changes in her in her terms of reference.
That was the Telegraph over there.
It was the Telegraph. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, there we are. Well done, Telegraph. Look, I came in some crisis in this organisation in 2013. I met Dame Janet for her to tell me how she was conducting her review. I was concerned, as she made absolutely clear, and she said it was a proper thing for me to do, that we couldn't wait for her report to be completed and published for us to do things to assess our policies to make sure we were absolutely tip-top, because I had seen the criticisms being levelled against us. So I think we did exactly the proper thing, and basically she said the same, which is to commission a review of all our policies, all our guidelines, including whistleblowing, and then get the good... You said Good Corporation in a sort of... Who are they? These are impressive people who, let me tell you, made 53 recommendations, 51 of which we've accepted, one we're still working on, and one we agreed, actually, we could find a better way of doing it. Good Corporation are experts. These are not people who will not speak truth to us, because they have done. They absolutely have done. Now, that's one set of things, because I want to make sure, as soon as I came back here, as quickly as we could, that we could do as much as we can to ensure that the culture, which I think the staff here believe in, and I certainly do, that we'd learn from the past. I think Dame Janet raises a very interesting issue about the prevalence of freelancers right across broadcasting, and how we can make sure that they too feel that they can talk about issues they think should be raised. And our whistleblowing policies and all the other policies apply to anyone who's working at the BBC, freelance or not. Nonetheless, she says, as you've read, take 6 months, think about this, review your policies, and that's one area I'll be having a look at. Because I don't care who people are, if they work for the BBC, I want to ensure that whatever they feel, if they feel they're being abused in any way, bullied, harassed, or sexually abused, I want them to have the confidence they must come forward. I have to say, I go back to it, today for me is an awful lot about the survivors. We owe that to them.
I'll just say a few words. Firstly, on the question about the change in the remit of Dame Janet Smith. If I go back to when Tony was brought in, as he said, in a period of crisis. He immediately set about changing things, changing the culture and changing the policies and the procedures. He came to the Trust saying that Dame Janet, for the reason she explained, was her report was going to be delayed, and that in the interest of making the BBC as good as it could possibly be in all of those policies and procedures, he wanted to change the remit and to bring in an expert who could do the audit and could report back to the BBC so that the BBC could start making the changes as soon as they possibly could. And when he came to us with that proposition, the Trust said, absolutely, we support you in doing that. And as Tony said, the Good report came and said, yes, a lot of positive changes, but more needs to be done. We obviously worked alongside the executive team as these came through. They have been overseen to make sure that they have been implemented. And as Tony has told you, 51 have been fully implemented, one ongoing and the other one that a different way to deal with it. So I absolutely think it was the right thing to do because it allowed the BBC to know what the best looked like and to make those changes. In terms of Dame Janet's finding that staff are still frightened, you ask, is that concerning? Of course it's concerning. What we have to do, and this goes to the cultural point, and what Tony, who lead the organisation and lead this cultural change, has to make sure is that the environment that, as Dame Janet said, that people feel comfortable raising a claim in whatever way they choose to, whether it's through their line or through the complaints or through the whistleblowing, they are not only feel able to, but when those complaints come, they are treated with respect. And the corollary is the fact that people will have to be open, both in giving and in receiving bad news. So I think that, yes, it is concerning, and that is absolutely the heart of the cultural shift that needs to happen. But what I would say was that gives every more reason why this report is important, because it gives that impetus to show people what happens when people don't speak up, or when they do, they are ignored or pushed aside. And I hope, as I said in my statement, that from today nothing will be the same, because people will realise just how these sexual predators operate and are able to see that and therefore be much more open to hearing complaints and investigating properly.
May I ask a quick
Look, we need to move on because we've had lots.
That your predecessor commissioned this report?
Sorry, I can't hear.
Are you pleased that your predecessor commissioned the Smith Review?
Well, please is a funny verb to use about a report which is as horrific as this. I'll use that slightly quaint word, content. I mean, this is, as I've made clear, this is what is described here is dreadful. It's a really dark day for the BBC, but we owe it to all those who gave witness to the reviews, and especially to those survivors of Savile and Hall, to do everything in our power to make sure it can't happen again. To that extent, absolutely worth it. And I also, by the way, I hope that in what we do and say going forward, that today is about the BBC, today is about getting the BBC in the place that we all believe it should be. But I also hope others will learn from us in the way that we handle this and the lessons for organisations right across the piece.
Okay, if we just go to the Mail and then to the Telegraph.
Hi there. You've made it very clear that Tony Blackburn parted company with the BBC because you had concerns over the way he engaged with the inquiry. Could you say very specifically whether you believe he lied to or deliberately misled the review? And second of all, can you tell us if he has received any money, whether as a settlement or in lieu of notice? Thank you.
I think Dame Janet made it absolutely clear how important the treatment of Mrs. McAlpine's complaint about her daughter was in understanding how the BBC handled complaints at the time. The paragraphs that are key, which I think are, if I remember, 9.181 and 9.56, shows that Tony Blackburn was interviewed on two occasions, once by Bill Cotton and once by Sir Brian Neal, QC. And when interviewed by Dame Janet, he denied he'd been interviewed on either occasion. Now, my view is that given the importance of this review and investigation, given the weight of responsibility of everyone to fully and frankly work with Dame Janet's review, I felt it was untenable for the BBC to continue its relationship because of that. And for that, we've parted our ways. In terms of contracts and so on, then I won't get drawn into that. That's a matter between the BBC and Mr Blackburn.
Okay. Neil?
I'm going wholly on what Dame Janet, in her report, very carefully says. And her phrase, I think, is she has rejected his evidence. She draws attention in both those two paragraphs to statements, a statement made by his solicitor. I think that's serious. Mr Blackburn, Tony Blackburn, fell short of the standards of evidence that such an inquiry demanded, and that's my belief, and therefore we acted accordingly.
Neil?
Neil Midgley from The Telegraph. It's clear the BBC staff just aren't convinced by the actions that you've taken and the nature, any amount of hotlines or mediation or raising awareness or discussions at BBC Trust. I mean, if it weren't for the libel laws, I could name 3 senior managers in the BBC against whom systematic allegations of bullying have been made. Those people have been moved on, subsequently one quietly left the BBC, others still in very senior positions. But clearly the allegations either accepted or acknowledged, given that they've been moved. So I wonder, I'm not aware of you personally having sacked or approved the sacking of any senior manager for bullying. And I wonder, am I right about that? And if you haven't sacked any of them, why won't you, given that leadership from you personally is what's required?
If you look at the number of bullying and harassment cases 2 years ago in the BBC, there were 75 and 3 cases of sexual harassment. Last year, in 14-15, there were 47 and 1 case of sexual harassment. These are cases where people have brought proper complaints to the BBC, have been investigated, some have been acted upon, some have not. Now, to my mind, that says that we are working and enabling a culture to take place where people feel they can stand up to power and can have bullying, harassment, issues of bad management in that sense dealt with. But let me also be clear with you. I've said, and I repeat, we've made a lot of progress. We've got a lot of progress to make. And I would say to you, if you have cases where you say you know people who are being bullied and harassed, then your job is to convince them. And I say to them now, come forward, use helplines or talk to managers or whatever, and let's get those cases dealt with, because that's what interests me.
But you're not answering the question. You won't sack senior managers. Why not?
I'm not going to go into individual cases because those cases of... I don't think that's right. But look, you're asking... I'm very happy to sit down and give you a detailed response if you want on the 75 cases we've dealt with in 1 year, 47 in another. Now, how many cases of bullying and harassment are dealt with in your organisation? I think, to my mind, that says that we're tackling this problem thoroughly. We're trying to get to grips with a culture which we are changing. And to my mind, we're making progress. Are we making enough? No. What is my message to the staff? Come forward if you have things that you are worried about or concerned about, and we'll deal with them.
Thank you.
Okay, just one more question at the front, and then I think we'll end.
Thank you. Esther Anderson, Childline. Tony, the BBC lives in a wider world, and this particular week we have seen Bishop Peter Ball convicted of serious sexual offences. We've seen the police accused of corruption in Rotherham, with 3 men accused of appalling sexual exploitation of children, and now we have the Savile report. You talk, and Dame Janet talks about deference, but the fact is that people find it so difficult to speak out. Are you really confident that with all the helplines organised by the BBC and all the new good corporation processes put in place, people will still dare to draw attention to sexual exploitation by people whom they know their job depends upon, whether it's the manager or whether it's the talent in the show or whether it's a senior BBC executive? And I'm wondering whether what we need to do is to ensure that something like the NSPCC helpline is widely publicised across the whole of society as a place where adults can safely and anonymously draw attention to these crimes?
I absolutely understand, because it's in your question and the question from the Telegraph before, which is, I understand how difficult it is, tougher it is for people. One, to work out, is this something that should be taken really seriously? You know, how do I know at what point? And secondly, then, to say, am I going to be listened to? Is this going to be dealt with? I mean, Dame Janet has asked us, and I accept that, to think very carefully before we get our policies reviewed again about how we can do everything to make that as easy as possible, knowing, as you're suggesting, it's difficult. Now, if there are things we can do beyond that as a broadcaster in programme terms to address these issues, to make it easier for the survivors of this sort of abuse to come forward, I'm up for talking about that. I think, I go back, I think that's the very least we owe to the survivors of Savile and Hall.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all, thank you. I want to start with the people who matter most, the victims or survivors, as many prefer to be known. When you read the report, almost all of them are numbers, prefaced by a letter. And what we've all got to remember, though, is that every one of these is an individual with their own thoughts, their own traumas, and their own terrible story they've been dealing with for so very long. So to all the survivors of Savile and Hall, every one of you, on behalf of the BBC, I would like to say this. What happened was profoundly wrong. It should never have started. It should certainly have been stopped. Whatever the circumstance and background to it, and clearly these reports explain this in some considerable detail, sexual abuse is sexual abuse. It can never be excused. Whatever the issues are, the idea that he was known as King Jimmy, there was no escape from him, and I quote, "No one will believe you." The idea that it was all right because that's Stuart Hall for you. Another who said that when she heard the report of Savile's death, she blurted out that she was glad he was dead, and then told her husband for the first time that Savile had raped her. And there was, if I may, one account that particularly stuck in my mind, one that hit me personally. One of the survivors was told, "Keep your mouth shut, he's a VIP." This hit me because it made it so very clear that we, the BBC, did that. Jimmy Savile committed many crimes in many places, but uniquely, it was the BBC that made him famous. We made him a VIP. And what this terrible episode teaches us, among other things, is that fame is power, a very strong form of power, and like any R for the BBC, there is as nothing compared to your pain. A serial rapist and a predatory sexual abuser both hid in plain sight at the BBC for decades. It was a dark chapter in the history of the organisation, but a much darker one for all of you. The BBC failed you when it should have protected you. I am deeply sorry for the hurt caused to each and every one of you. I also know that it cannot have been easy for you to come forward and confront the past like this. Many of you have done so for the first time. I admire your courage. I'm grateful for your honesty. Your voice has finally been heard, but I also recognise it's been heard far, far too late. So today we say sorry. We let you down, and we know it. We also say thank you. Your courage in speaking out lights the way for us all. And now we must do everything possible to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. We will learn the lessons of this dark period for ourselves, and we will help share them with others. The two reports commissioned by my predecessor have many judgments for us to reflect on and much advice to offer. They draw conclusions and demand responses. But the most powerful of their contents, the parts that, once read, cannot be forgotten, are the stories of the survivors themselves. For everyone who truly wants to understand, this is the place to start, and I would urge every one of you to read those chapters. It's all there. The scale, the nature of what they did was truly terrible. The way that Savile used his celebrity to promise access to excitement and fun, and then grotesquely exploited it. The oppressive power of his fame and his physical presence. The sense that no one would believe a complaint. Even in their own families, survivors felt alone. Form of power, it must be held to account. It must be limited. It must be scrutinised. And it wasn't. It's too easy to say that this took place a long time ago, in another time and another BBC. We're not going to say that. The report identifies many failings. Saying, of course, that all of it was in the past would be wrong. The BBC is its past as well as its future. And we've taken pride and drawn strength from all we have been and all we have done. What sort of organisation would we be if we celebrated our history but failed to take responsibility for it? Before I talk of the action we're going to take, let me add one more thing. I note that the reports did not conclude that, in a formal sense, the BBC knew about Savile. But I take no satisfaction from that. It seems to me that the BBC could have known. Just as powerful as the accusation you knew,